going over the business. First of all, my name is Susie Spickle, and I'm the Community Programs Director and a naturalist at the Harris Center. And for those of you who have never been to the Harris Center before, maybe you're from California or Illinois, or maybe even just from Keene and you've never come out, we invite you. We're in Hancock, New Hampshire, and we are a small but very mighty land trust in southwestern New Hampshire. And we like to call them the kind of the hills of New Hampshire, the Highland Hills of New Hampshire, where we have lots of good bees. We've been very busy for the past 50 years protecting land. We have about 24,000 acres of protected land. And in that land, we spend a lot of time helping people connect to the natural world, people of all ages, from little babies in backpacks all the way to people who are in assisted living and memory care. So lifespan, we do it all. And we also do some other great stuff. We do a lot of community science programs where you might have heard about our salamander brigades. We have Brett Thielen here tonight. She's our conservation science director and the head of the salamander brigades that crossed over 10,000 salamanders this year. Remarkable. Well, amphibians, it wasn't just all salamanders. Pretty awesome. And yeah, we just keep real busy at the Harris Center. So you can check out our events and all about the Harris Center at our website. We'll put that in the chat, which is already there. We do have a lot of great events coming up this winter. They're not up yet, but if you keep your eye on our website and our calendar, you'll be seeing them going up soon. Look out for a program on scat detecting dogs from the University of Washington, dogs being used to help conservation researchers find scat of hard to find animals. We have a program on winter loon rescues. I think I'm going to be really interested in that. We have tons of hikes and other events, so keep your eyes on our calendar. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. We're going to save all the questions until the end, and then we'll have a chance for a Q&A with Nick. So put your questions in the chat, and then Miles and I will share those questions with Nick. So on to tonight's program, which we're all super excited about, The Secret Lives of Wild Bees with Nick Dorian. And I had a great time talking with Nick. I got to give my colleague Brett Thielen a shout out for finding Nick. We're always looking for fabulous presenters with interesting topics, and Brett kind of discovered Nick, and we got really excited because Nick is the co-founder and president of the Tufts Pollinator Initiative, where he has been studying bees at Tufts. He's in a PhD program. He's studying population ecology of bees, and bees have taken him all over, from Arizona to the Bahamas to Costa Rica, but he says that he loves the bees in his backyard the most. And we're going to get to find out what makes Nick love bees so much. So welcome, Nick. We're delighted to have you tonight. Yay for the bees.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Susie. That was such a wonderful introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak through the Harris Center today. It is my utmost pleasure to tell you and teach you and perhaps excite you about bees, whether you are an enthusiast of solitary bees, a lover of pollinators, or perhaps are giving bees a chance and have never given insects much thought. I'd like to just make a plug, although Susie already did this, for our group that I run. It's called the Tufts Pollinator Initiative. And if you live in cities or backyards and you're interested in supporting pollinators, check us out. We have lots of great guides on how to identify the insects in your gardens, on what plants are great for insects. And a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about today will be summarized in a variety of formats on that website. It's no secret that pollinators are important. They're important for our healthy ecosystems, and they're important for our healthy food systems. Over 90% of wild plants, that's the colorful meadows that dot the hills of Vermont and of New Hampshire and New England, require animal pollination, and 75% of our top global crops, all the color in our diet, from blueberries to pumpkins to coffee, requires animal pollination. And in a world without animal pollinators, our roadsides would be less colorful and our plates would be less colorful. When we think of who the pollinators are, we often think of bees. Indeed, bees are some of their most important pollinators because they've evolved with plants over a very long period of time. When we think of bees, we think of these guys, the honeybees, I should say these ladies, All of them are female bees, and they have a penchant for hexagons. They fill their nests with baby bees that they feed pollen and nectar, and they live in big hives. A queen, she can lay thousands of eggs a day, and the hives can reach 30 to 50,000 bees. And so as a result, farmers use bees for pollination of their crops, specifically the honeybees. And around 2006, farmers and beekeepers noticed something, that there were fewer honeybees in their hives. And this prompted the Save the Bees movement, which captured the attention and the concern of an entire generation. You started seeing Cheerios putting Save the Bees on cereal boxes. People started making Save the Bee t-shirts. You even saw like celebrities like Morgan Freeman and Angelina Jolie saving bees in their own ways. But there's one problem with all of this, is that the bees that everyone is concerned about, the honeybees, they actually don't need saving. Honeybees are best thought of as domesticated livestock, in the sense that they're not from here. We brought them over in the 1600s, and we manage them intensely. Beekeepers know everything about their bees. They can make more of them, and if hives are not doing well, we can spend money to raise more in a lab. It sounds a lot more like raising chickens than it does saving a wild animal. And so this graph here basically shows that there's been a consistent amount of honeybee colonies in the US, despite increased mortality over the winter. So honeybees may be not doing so well, but they're not necessarily indicative of an environmental concern, more an agricultural concern. But there are other bees that do need saving, and that's what I want to spend the rest of the day talking about. These are the bees that need our attention. These are our native wild bees. These are the bees that have been here for thousands of years, that have a relationship with the plants that live around us. Just take in this array for a second. We have green bees, and we have bees that are fuzzy. We have bees with antennae longer than their body. We have bees that only eat hibiscus and can walk on water. We have bees that swim through sand, bees that carry pollen on their bums, bees that are only active for 4 weeks out of the year and live on the coast, feeding on sumac. The list goes on and on. There's over 4,000 species of wild bees in North America, over 400 in Massachusetts alone. And although they're diverse and varied in form and structure and behavior, many of them are not doing well. Some of you might have heard of the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis. 25 years ago, Bombus affinis was one of the most abundant cranberry pollinators in the Northeast. You couldn't not go to a cranberry farm and see Bombus affinis on cranberries. And as a result, cranberry farmers relied a lot on the presence of this bee for their profits. Similarly, the yellow-banded bumblebee, Bombus terricola, used to be widespread throughout New England and eastern Massachusetts and eastern US. But similarly, like Bombus affinis, it's gone south. Over the last 20 years, it's sharply declined throughout the Northeast. Now, in this case, New Hampshire remains a stronghold, and we can find Bombus terricola throughout the state. But in the context of Bombus affinis, we can now only find them in the Midwest. They used to be throughout the Northeast, and now their range is reduced by 90% over the last 30 years. And we see that there are winners and losers in the context of bee declines. Some, like Bombus affinis and Bombus terricola, have declined sharply over the last 30, 40 years. But others, like Bombus impatiens with the blue dot next to them, or Bombus ternarius, have actually increased. So I share this not to say that all bees are declining or that it's doom and gloom from here on out. There are bees that are doing better than before. But I share this also because the bees that aren't doing very well really aren't doing well, and we don't quite know what's going on. We think it has to do a lot with a combination of factors. Habitat loss, pesticides, and climate change are the big three, but also things like invasive plant species and insect species, lawns and agriculture, and pollution. Not any one of these on its own, but the synergy between all of them and others. There's one thing that's missing from this, however, which is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about as a scientist, and that is their biggest secret is their biggest threat. That we have no idea what most of these bees do throughout their life cycles. We don't know where they go in the winter. We see them on flowers for a month, but after that, the next 11 months are a mystery to us. So in order to save the native bees, we need to know the native bees. And as I'll conclude today, everybody needs to know the native bees because everybody can play a part in saving them. And so what I hope to do in this talk today is inspire you to know the bees so that you can care about them and have an empathy for them so that you'd like to take action to save them. Before we get to know the bees, we have to actually know what a bee is. Everybody knows that bees like flowers. But this is actually not a bee. This is a fly. This is a drone fly, a fantastic honeybee mimic that only has 2 wings and stubby antennae and really big eyes. And everybody knows that bees like picnics, but actually these are not bees either. These are yellow jacket wasps, the bees that you see on your food. This actually is a bee. This is a longhorn bee. She has 4 wings. She's very fuzzy. She has long antennae, and she carries pollen, like in grocery bags on her hind legs. Other than that, there's not much differentiating bees from other insects like wasps, except for their diet. And so that's my definition of a bee. A bee is a vegetarian wasp. To understand why this is, we have to think about where bees came from a time before there were flowers 130 million years ago. If we can think back to then, which of course we can't, but back then, 130 million years ago, scientists have posited that the earliest flowers were visited by beetles and tiny insects called thrips. Thrips like to chew. They're chewing insects and like to chew on sort of flower tissue, including petals. Now, there are wasps at this time, although there are no bees, and there are wasps, and wasps are carnivores. They get their protein from other insects. And so, of course, there are beetle hunting wasps, but there are also thrip hunting wasps. And these thrips hunting wasps would catch insects, these thrips, on flowers, and those thrips would be dusted in pollen. Now, over many millions of years, you might imagine that it's advantageous to start hunting a protein source that can't move. Why would you hunt a thrips when you could hunt pollen? So bees have evolved from 20 species of wasps into 20,000 species of bees, all of which consume pollen as their main source of protein. And because bees have been in this very long-term relationship, they have some adaptations that allow them to cope and be a good partner to flowers, as we'll continue the analogy. They actually have branched hairs. So all over a bee's body, you can find that they have these hairs, and those hairs have branches of hairs, and those branches have branches. And that's an adaptation to increase the surface area of their body so that they can carry pollen. So bees are really efficient transporters of pollen because it's their main source of food. And wasps aren't very hairy because they have to be slender and quick and agile to hunt prey. So beyond that, bees do collect pollen. But what do our native bees do? We want to get to know them. What do they do? Well, bees make more of themselves. And in order to make more of themselves, they have to do three things throughout their life cycle. They have to build a nest where they're going to place babies. They have to get food to feed those babies, which come from flowers. And then they have to spend the next 10 or so months out of sight, but they can't be out of mind, out of sight, developing and hibernating over the winter. You probably already know one of our native bees, and that's bumblebees. I saw many of you indicated that bumblebees were some of your favorite bees. What's not to love about a bumblebee? They're big, fuzzy, charismatic, and you see them throughout the year on flowers in your garden. That's because bumblebees are a kind of a social bee, just like honeybees. They build hives. In the springtime, right when the snow melts, you can see the big queen bumblebees zooming low along the ground. She's looking for a cavity that already exists, such as beneath a rock or an old rodent burrow, or even beneath your shed. She'll find a place that she finds suitable, and she'll gather pollen from spring blooming trees like red maples or wildflowers that grow in the understory like trout lilies. And she'll pack that pollen and nectar into a ball called bee bread, and she'll lay some eggs on that bee bread. And those eggs will hatch into baby larvae that eat that pollen and nectar and emerge as worker bumblebees. All of these workers are female, And they now are responsible for the upkeep of the hive. The queen is going to stay back and lay eggs, and the workers, about half of her body size, will go out and collect pollen. And some of the first pollen they encounter is the lupin that's blooming all along the roadsides of New Hampshire. If you're from the New England, it's hard to not want to go see all the lupin displays along the road. Now, this is a non-native lupin that is really good at colonizing sort of disturbed soils. And as a result, they form these huge monocultures of flowers. For the month they bloom, bumblebees are loving it. It's all the pollen that they can get for miles, literally miles and miles along the road. But what happens in June when the lupin stops blooming? Well, the roadsides that were formerly covered in lupin flowers have no food for the bees, so they have to find something else. And in fact, they often go to other places like backyard gardens. Bumblebees can fly over a mile in search of food. And so they'll visit gardens like this one that has a diversity of colors and shapes and sizes of flowers that you might find pretty, and the bumblebees certainly find it pretty too. This is their grocery store, and she's going to pick up pollen and nectar. Now, bumblebees are really good at doing what they do. They're really good at getting pollen from flowers that have kept the pollen under lock and key. What do I mean by this? There are some flowers that keep their pollen locked up in tubes. And in order for the pollen to be released, the bumblebees need to vibrate their bodies really quick. This is in a video. I'm just going to let you see it. This is a flower that a bumblebee has grabbed and is vibrating her flight muscles at the right frequency. And the pollen is sort of cascading out the tip, just like snow. What's that frequency, you might ask? Some say it's middle C. So bumblebee workers gather pollen throughout the summer. And she packs it into her legs and she brings it back to the hive to raise her sisters. And then in the fall, when the hive is big enough, more flowers are needed to make sure the bumblebees have enough food to complete the generation. Bumblebee queens and males, the next generation, are produced when the hive is big enough. The queens and males mate. They fuel up on goldenrod, and the queens that have been mated survive the winter underground. The males, the old colony, the old workers, it all dies at the end of the year. And the new queen, the next generation, finds a place to live for the winter before emerging next spring to complete the cycle. So bumblebees need both safe spots to nest throughout the year and flowers throughout the year. Flowers in just 1 month won't cut it. Bumblebees need that continual supply of food and flowers. And so that's why, diverse landscapes, things that have lots of biodiversity of flowers, are really important. But native bees live in many different kinds of societies. We've talked a lot about the social bees, like the honeybees and the bumblebees, but actually the vast majority of bees are what are known as solitary bees. About 80% of bees live solitary lives, no queen, no hive. And that means they don't make any honey either. But it also means they have no need to sting because there's no society they're trying to defend. So 80% of our bees are incredibly gentle and docile, and they live these fascinating solitary lives. The bee that is my favorite bee, and the one that I've spent the last 5 years studying for my graduate work, is the cellophane bee. This is a female in her nest entrance, and she builds her nest underground. Just like bumblebees, solitary bees have 1 generation per year, but this generation is very short. They're active only in the springtime for about a month, when males and females emerge to mate. Over the summer, the baby bees in the nest develop. In the fall, they metamorphose, just like a butterfly. Bees metamorphose from a larva into an adult, and they spend the winter underground. So we only see cellophane bees for a short period of time, and perhaps this ephemerality of cellophane bees is what makes them my favorite. Sort of like the spring ephemerals or spring, or the thing you only get to do once a year. It's kind of great to see them for only a month a year, and then you have to spend the next 11 months waiting to see them again. This is a local park near Tufts where I go to school and I work. And I came down here last early March 10th, and spring seemed so far away. But sure enough, it was 50 degrees out, and the tiny cellophane bee males were carrying spring on their wing, even though the tree buds still looked brown and the lake was frigid. There were bees out and about buzzing on the sand and the leaves that were in the sun. The males are really eager to find a mate. They emerge before the females, And this is a video of what an aggregation of bees looks like. If you look closely, you'll see tiny little dots moving low along the ground. This is a sunny slope no bigger than a Volkswagen, and there are thousands of male bees, none of whom can sting, by the way, all zooming around, close to the ground so they can smell the females as they emerge. When a female emerges, a whole pile of males locates her, and they brawl on the ground, tumbling and tussling. They call it a mating ball. And the males jostle to find a female to mate with, and just one emerges victorious, and the two of them will mate. All of this happens in like a few hours upon emergence. And after that, the females are like, get the heck out of here. The males are not needed after that. In fact, the males don't help with anything. They are literally great for mating, and that's about it. So the females really want to get it out of the way. They get mating done, and then they hold the sperm in a special organ, and they can use it whenever they want. The females then get to work. She digs a nest underground, often near to others, and she digs a nest under the ground. It goes about 10, 12 inches deep, and she'll often sit in her nest entrance, sunning herself. Now, you don't have to go far to find these bees. They live in backyards and sandy paths and near riverbanks. And you often can find them because they build these really conspicuous neighborhoods where many females will build nests near each other. This is a neighborhood of cellophane bees, and each little ant hill that you see here is actually the home of a bee. The entrance of which is about the width of a pencil, which is how you tell them apart from ant hills. The females mark the sand around their nest with an individual fragrance that she knows is hers and not her neighbor's. So they don't have mailboxes, they don't have addresses, but they do have fragrances. And this is something to keep in mind, is that bees see the world very differently than we see it. They do have color vision, but bees also sense the world through smell. And so things that seem impossible to us, like differentiating these holes in the ground, is literally child's play to a bee. It's something that they're born with. It's this innate instinct. Females will then take trips from their nest entrance to flowers like the red maples along the shore banks of that lake, and she'll collect pollen intentionally in grocery bags on her legs, and she'll pack it into these long hairs, but also incidentally. You see the pollen all over her abdomen and her head? That's pollination in action. Pollination is not intentional. A cellophane bee does not wake up and say, oh my goodness, the maple tree needs some pollination today. I'm worried it's not going to set enough fruit. No, the bee is like, I want fruit for myself. And in getting up in those flowers, getting all messy with that pollen, she incidentally transfers pollen from flower to flower. And that is pollination. She'll carry that pollen back, the pollen that she put in her leg, she'll carry that back to her nest, where she will go to the chamber that she prepared the night before. At night, these bees create chambers for their babies out of a natural waterproof lining akin to cellophane, which is where they get their names. So she takes her spit and she applies it along the inside of the nest. And it's this nice little jelly bean sized bag. She regurgitates nectar, she scrapes pollen off of her legs, and she forms this sort of microbial rich pollen soup that is going to be the food for her offspring. Now, if you're thinking about this, this is a really rich source of nectar and sugar, and the bee baby is really lucky to have such a hardworking mom. But there are other insects that try to ruin this harmony. There are beetles. These beetles are like walking death for a bee. This beetle female, she can't fly, and she's walking through the aggregation. This is a parasite, and her aim is to sneak an egg into the nest of a bee. She's not going to do it on her own, because that would be way too conspicuous, a beetle in a bee's nest. Instead, she lays eggs in the sand, and when the eggs hatch, the eggs smell like a female bee, like the larvae smell like a female bee. Male bees, as we mentioned, are really eager and zealous to find a mate, and they cannot resist anything that is possibly a female. So the male bees approach this ball of larvae that smells like a female bee, and they attempt to mate with the ball of larvae. In doing so, they pick up some of these larvae on their back, and then they find a real female bee to mate with, and those larvae transfer from the male to the female. Now the larvae are exactly where they need to be. Upon the female going back with groceries in tow, some of those larvae hop off, and unbeknownst to the female, she has now just parasitized her own nest with beetles. This is really easy to say, oh my goodness, why do these beetles need to exist? They are destroying this like beautiful harmony of bees. But in fact, this is all part of the fabric of why bees are important. Without the maple trees, we don't have cellophane bees. Without the cellophane bees, we don't have the blister beetles. And the fact that blister beetles are here indicates that there are enough bees to support their predators. And so I love seeing this in action. It brings me joy that blister beetles and cellophane bees can live at the same place, and that there's room enough for everybody. So this will be a theme today, but just think about how remarkable it is that this life cycle could evolve, that you lay eggs in sand that smell like a female bee, that a male bee wants to mate with, that then transfers into the nest. It's just, how does it even work? And we thought gambling was risky, right? By the middle of April, Patriots Day in Boston, cellophane bees are gone. People are having picnics at the picnic area, but there are no cellophane bees to speak of. They're underground. And for the next 11 months, the baby bees in those brood cells will develop from larva to adult, and then emerge the next spring when the temperatures warm up, and I'll be down there on my bike to see them. Other bees live above ground. So the vast majority of bees live below ground, other bees live above ground. We have three kinds of bees that live above ground. We have the renters, we have the excavators, and we have the architects. The renters, some of you may be familiar with. These are bees that occupy pre-existing cavities. Mason bees and leafcutter bees are some of the most familiar ones. And they're familiar because of this movement that has been growing for the last 15 years or so of people installing bee hotels in their backyards. Bee hotels are bundles of reeds that are hollow or holes drilled in logs that provide above ground cavities for these renters to move into. In addition to pollen and nectar to provide for their babies, these renters also need building materials. And it's in their name. Leafcutter bees need leaves. Resin bees need tree sap, and mason bees need mud. Now, evidence of these bees is all around us, and some of you may have seen these on leaves in your gardens. This is an example of a leaf that I found walking through the city. Now, this is kind of conspicuous. What leaf grows with little Swiss cheese holes cut out the end of it? In fact, this is a clue that a leafcutter bee is in the area. She has gone up to the edge of this leaf, and she's sliced with her mandibles a disc just big enough for a bee to carry. And she carries it underneath her abdomen, and she goes back to her cavity and she places it as the back wall. Then she goes and gets another disc and she puts it on the side, and she forms these jelly beans, not out of her spit like the cellophane bees, but out of leaves. So in addition to needing flowers, and in addition to needing a place to nest, bees also need leaves or mud to complete their life cycle. Now, I should mention that these cavities are also quite vulnerable. This is a parasitic wasp. And this wasp, again, doesn't dare enter the nest of the bee. That's far too difficult. Instead, it connives to lay an egg directly into the nest. Its egg-laying ovipositor, the egg-laying organ, is sort of wrapped along the top of its abdomen. And as we'll see in the video, it can be incredibly long. On the right side of this video, we have a female wasp. Out of this female wasp's abdomen, we see an incredibly long line. This is her ovipositor. The ovipositor skips this first brood cell, which the female is actively provisioning, the female bee. So it would be very conspicuous if there was an intruder. Instead, she skips that one and she goes into the next one. And I just want to watch what happens. So we have the female wasp, and just watch the tip of the abdomen in that second cell. Oh my God, oh my God. She just laid an egg. What? How did that happen? It's incredible, right? So that brood cell is doomed. there is a bee in there, a very small and defenseless bee, but now there is a wasp, and that wasp is adapted to dispatching of that prey and consuming all the pollen and nectar to develop. And so from this nest next year, we will get bees and we will get wasps. Other bees excavate their own nests. They don't occupy pre-existing cavities, but instead they find pithy stems like raspberry canes or elderberry stems to hollow out. They're called carpenter bees because not because they eat this pithy wood, but because they excavate it. Carpenter bees some carpenter bees are very tiny. You know, these are tiny blue carpenter bees, but others are more familiar, these big carpenter bees that we see flying around our decks. Both of them are carpenter bees because of how they make their nests, but they do so in very different places. The tiny carpenter bees are very inconspicuous, and they will live in stems in your garden. Like if you grow raspberries, they'll grow on your raspberry stems. But the big carpenter bees are kind of problematic, especially for people that own wooden decks. And the carpenter bees will chew holes through your unpainted deck, and those holes will get bigger and bigger from year to year as more and more live there. And it's unfortunate because carpenter bees are exceptional pollinators for many of our crops, but they do have this negative interaction with people. So if the carpenter bees are giving you a problem, I recommend a few things. One, you can paint over the wood and plug the entrance with steel wool or caulk. I would avoid spraying pesticides and chemicals just willy-nilly, especially like in the air as they're flying. If you do need to get rid of them, I'm happy to advise. You can send me an email to at the link that I posted in the chat. But sometimes targeted applications of treatments are required. But again, I would never advocate for that unless it's really jeopardizing the integrity of your house. So what else do our native bees do? Well, they build nests, and that was a real quick run through of how bees build nests. We could have spoken for hours about that. But bees also visit flowers, and bees and their relationships with flowers, I think, is what captures our attention and our curiosity the most. We rarely see bees at their nest entrance. In fact, most bees, we have no idea where they nest. But bees on flowers, well, this is something that everybody can get behind. You can plant a flower, and the next day, there will be bees on that flower. As I've alluded to before, bees visit flowers for food. They're vegetarians. They're vegans, actually. Their entire diet comes from plants. Their carbohydrates and sugars come from nectar, and their protein comes from pollen. Now, lots of flowers look very different, and bees don't always, bees have preferences when they visit flowers. A lot of their preferences actually come from their length of their tongue. Long-tongued bees are able to visit flowers that are either short or long, where the nectar is, and short-tongued bees, well, they really can't visit the deep flowers. On the left, we have a bumblebee, and many bumblebees have quite long tongues. And so this is a wild bergamot flower, also known as bee balm. And each of these purple trumpets is open, but then at the top, it has about half an inch or so before you reach the nectar. Only bees with long enough tongues to drink that nectar will be able to visit that flower. In contrast, shorter flowers are suitable food sources for these tiny masked bees. They have incredibly short tongues, and a masked bee would never know what to do with a monarda. And so as you watch bees in your gardens, you can start to pay attention to which bees are associating with which flowers, and is it at all related to what the flower looks like? You'll see hummingbirds visiting very deep tubular flowers because they have long bills. You won't see a hummingbird visiting a tiny flat Queen Anne's lace. It has no idea where to put its bill in that. That being said, some bees don't like to play by the rules, and the carpenter bees are one of those bees that really don't like playing by the rules. They eat your deck. They also steal nectar from flowers. This is a sage flower, and the carpenter bee, instead of being the good bee citizen that it could be and going through the opening of the flower, instead takes its mandibles and slices a hole in the base of the flower, and then drinks nectar, not contacting pollen, not depositing pollen. It's called nectar robbing. And not only that, but a hole on a flower does not repair itself. And so the carpenter bee has now made an avenue for lots of other bees to also do the same thing. Very bad influence on bees. But this is another thing you can see. If you go onto tubular flowers in your garden, like sage or hostas or things like that, you can see little incisions at the base of the flower where a carpenter bee has made a cut and other bees have reaped the rewards. Nectar is like soda to bees. It can be really, really sugar rich. But in addition to that energy source, bees also need pollen, and they stock the pantry with this protein-rich pollen. Pollen can be really protein-rich, and bees want to make sure they don't lose any of what they caught, what they captured. So this longhorn bee, for example, see these big hairs on her hind legs. Those hairs are specifically designed to carry a ton of pollen. When they're filled, they sort of look like she's wearing chaps. And so they're called chap-legged bees because they just have these huge pants on their hind legs laden with pollen. But not all bees carry pollen on their legs. Some bees carry it dry beneath their abdomens, on their butts. Others carry it dry on their legs. And the most ingenious of everything, it's actually carrying it wet on your legs. Bumblebees and honeybees make a pellet of pollen on their legs so that it cannot ever become dislodged during foraging. When the pollen's dry, it's like baby powder. If you touch your hand, some of the pollen's going to plume into the air. But if you were to mix that with water, or in this case, nectar, that pollen is not available for pollination, and whatever the bee catches, she can bring back to her nest. It's sort of like sealing up the grocery bag or locking your car. You don't want to get it let it out. Now, a lot of nectar is sort of universal, call it the universal energy source, but pollen, not so much. Plants don't want their pollen being eaten. Pollen is supposed to be used for plant reproduction, not for bee reproduction. But about 30% of native bees have figured out ways of sort of subverting this. Plants that have toxic pollen or pollen that otherwise is not suitable is in fact suitable to a handful of bees. And these are the specialists. These are the bees that specialize on only one kind of pollen. Sunflower pollen is notoriously nutrient poor, but sunflower bees have figured out a way of doing it. That longhorn bee, all she eats is sunflowers. So if you plant blueberries, she won't eat it because, in fact, she's not out in spring when blueberries are flowering. She's only out in the summer. In contrast, blueberry bees are only out during blueberry bloom. And goldenrod and asters have their own suite of specialists, like this longhorn bee that visits this purple aster. And because of this specialization, it does you no good to be out at a time when your favorite flowers are not blooming. And so their life cycles are incredibly precise. The blueberry bees, which I study up in New Hampshire, only emerge like 3 days before the blueberry bloom, and they're out until the blueberries finish. Then they're gone. Their life cycle is perfectly timed to coincide with the opening of their favorite grocery store once a year. All of this to say, if you understand these interactions between bees and their favorite plants, it becomes really easy to attract your favorite bees to your yard. So if you plant it, invariably they will come. And my favorite example of this is squash. By growing squash in your yard, you also grow squash bees, whether you knew it or not. Importantly, squash is not native to New Hampshire or Eastern North America. In fact, is native to the desert Southwest and northern Mexico. Over thousands of years, native peoples traded squash as one of their staple food sources, the three sisters, squash, beans, and corn. And so squash was incredibly important and planted every year without fail. As it was traded along these routes and planted at a wider and wider radius outside of its native range, the squash bees followed. So in a sense, these trade routes helped to domesticate the squash bee out of its tiny native range in the desert to its now native range throughout all of North America. Last year, they found it for the first time in Oregon. Every year, the squash bees emerge at the end of June, early July, just as the first squash flower zucchini blossoms in my garden are blooming. Their lives completely revolve around squash. The males and the females are mating, and the females say, "Get the heck out of here, males, I don't have time for you." And so early in the morning, when the squash blooms are open, the females get to work drinking nectar, collecting pollen for their underground nests, which look like these anthills. The males attempt to interfere with all of this activity, but at noon, when the squash flowers are closing because it's hot outside, the females retire to their nests. Now, the squash bees, males, are not welcome in the nest because that's female-only space. And so the males have to take their siesta somewhere else. They take it inside the flowers. What? This is the cutest thing in the world. If you grow zucchini, or if you want to grow zucchini, next summer, 2 in the afternoon, go out to your big blossom and peel it open, and you will find yourself face to face with like 3 squash bee males. It is the most adorable thing in the world, and they can't sting you, right? Like these are male bees, they cannot sting. So it is like the safest way to get up close with a native bee. And I promise you they'll be there. Like, especially if your neighbors have grown squash for a few years, their populations start to build up, and it's just a real treat. If you're a keen observer, and you watch other flowers in your gardens like sunflowers, you might also observe a predator of the squash bee. I told you there's a theme here. There's always a predator to go along with these bees. The cuckoo bee. This is not a beetle. This is not a wasp. This is another bee. This entire bee strategy, and this is about 15% of all bee species are cuckoo bees. Their strategy is to lay eggs in nests that they did not build. This bee on a flower, she looks like a wasp. She is hairless. Doesn't have pollen on her legs. She's just drinking nectar, and she's incredibly efficient at locating the nest of squash bees. This is a squash bee nest in the ground, and watch who comes out of it. We looked at squash bees, they're kind of fuzzy and orange. That's not a squash bee. Why is a non-squash bee coming out of that nest? So while mama squash bee is out collecting pollen, she leaves the door wide open. This cuckoo bee seizes her chance. She slips in, cloaked in pheromones, lays an egg in a brood cell, and slips out undetected. That brood cell, that egg that she lays is microscopic. So mama squash bee comes back, she puts pollen in the nest, and she has no idea what has just transpired. She seals up the cell, seals up her nest, she dies. A few days later, war breaks out. The cuckoo bee hatches first. The cuckoo bee has enormous mandibles. This is the larva of the cuckoo bee. The cuckoo bee larva slices the host bee egg in half and then is free to eat all of the pollen and nectar that he or she desires. But there's karma in the garden, I will add, and cuckoo bees sometimes get snatched by crab spiders. Do you see it? This is a camouflaged crab spider that has caught an unsuspecting cuckoo bee. Now I share this cuckoo bees are as essential as the squash bees to the sort of the fabric of all of this, and the crab spiders are essential too. And so this simple act of planting squash, mind you, a very selfish act because we're trying to get food for ourselves, not only grows squash bees, but those squash bees grow cuckoo bees, and those cuckoo bees grow crab spiders, and those crab spiders grow mockingbirds, and those mockingbirds grow hawks. And all of a sudden, we have this incredibly intricate web of biodiversity, all because we just wanted like zucchini bread in December. And so the simple act of planting flowers can have an incredible impact on the nature around you, and it helps bring these hidden interactions out and into view. This is all to say that you can make a difference. Unlike a lot of sort of environmental issues that seem distant and hard to achieve, or how can I make a difference by changing this one thing in my life? By planting flowers and doing a few other things, you actually can make a difference in the lives of these insects. And I've summarized it in 5 things. Use seeds to save native bees. That's SEEDS. S stands for spread native flowers. Because when you spread native flowers, you're spreading the flowers that these bees have co-evolved with, the ones that they've been in a relationship for tens of thousands of years. The flowers that need to be buzz pollinated, like tomatoes and chilies that bumblebees are familiar with, or blueberries or cranberries. And by spreading native flowers, you can do this as part of a larger meadow. But if you have a yard or a garden, or even just a raised bed, you can create a garden for pollinators like bees. You'll hear this term thrown around, pollinator garden. And all it is an area intentionally designed and planted with the needs of insect pollinators in mind. And importantly, it's an area that you feel comfortable in. There's a lot of advice out there about how to do this. And the most important advice is what you think is pretty. And then that advice sort of mediated by what pollinators need. One of the most important things you can do when planting a garden is to plant diversity. What I mean by this is a diversity of flowers, of shape, of color, of size, but also bloom time. As we learned, some of these insects have life cycles that are only active for a month every year. Flowers like the lupin in May don't support aster and goldenrod specialists that are active in the late summer. So what does this look like? At Tufts in our gardens in April, there's not many insects out. It's still kind of cold. The threat of frost still hasn't gone away entirely, but some spring blooming trees like red maples are in the area, and that's who's feeding the early pollinators. Spring blooming trees in May, like apples and hawthorns, sort of pick up steam, and they're providing thousands and millions of flowers for these bees to provision their nests with. In fact, there's a whole smorgasbord of bee diversity, the mining bees that we didn't even talk about today, that are mostly found in tree canopies. By June, the flowers in our gardens have begun to bloom, like these penstemons and phlox and common milkweed, feeding not only bees, but monarch butterflies that are starting to arrive, and beetles that live their entire life cycle on common milkweed. In July, our flowers have started to come into full bloom, and we've planted them in clumps. We have clumps of yellow, clumps of white candelabras and fountains of yellow flowers. So we've tried to vary the size and the color of the plants, but also making sure they're planted in big areas so that bees that like a particular flower have enough of it in our garden. By August, the garden is just out of control, and it's just all these colors. It's just an absolute firecracker of a site to visit. And this is when diversity peaks. So when our peak flower diversity is in bloom, we have our peak insect diversity. We've recorded over 125 species using our gardens. This is 1/10 of an acre throughout the year. By September, our insane bonanza of flowers has sort of subsided, and the goldenrods and asters, they are the ones that are going to carry us to frost. And in fact, we've had at least 2 frosts, and our flowers are still blooming. This is not to say that there's thousands of insects using them. This is to say that any insect that needs food can find it in our garden. After snow comes and all insects have retired for the year, our garden still produces. All of that pollination happening produced fruits. Fruits, yes, like the red berries on the hawthorn tree, but also dry fruits like goldenrod seeds that in turn feed birds like sparrows through the winter and goldfinches. In fact, goldfinches ate all of the seeds of our purple coneflowers, and we had none to share with people. So that's, to me, is like the best sign that our garden is doing its job. And then the vegetation that we leave in the garden provides cover over the winter. Some sources of native plants and information that you can think about during the winter. Winter is a wonderful time for contemplation and for planning your garden next year. And so here are a few areas local to New Hampshire that I think provide some great resources. I see we have a lot of people from around the country. I'll make a plug for Prairie Moon Nursery and Prairie Nursery, 2 big sources in the Midwest for sourcing plants that are great in prairies. I couldn't give a talk without giving my plug for some of my favorite picks. I'm happy to share these slides afterwards. So my picks for season-long blooms, for bees in particular, I've picked things like coreopsis and beard tongue, wild bergamot, also known as bee balm, purple coneflower, New York ironweed, early sunflower, New England aster, and goldenrods. I tried to pick plants that I know support a lot of generalist bees, but also specialists, like Lanceleaf coreopsis supports aster specialists early in the spring. Purple coneflowers support aster specialists in summer. New England aster and goldenrods, aster specialists in the fall. I've picked things that don't all look the same. We have flowers that look like big plates, and things that look like bells, and others that look like trumpets. And lastly, I've picked flowers that are easily sourced. One of the biggest barriers to getting started is finding these flowers that you'd like to include. And all the flowers on this list should be easily sourced from a local nursery. And if you don't, tell them to source it, because these should be very easy to find. That being said, a lot of us don't necessarily have sun in our backyards. A lot of these flowers need sun. And so I couldn't not also make a plug for some shade-tolerant blooms. These might be a little harder to find, but more and more nurseries are starting to carry them. Things like wild geranium is amazing, and as you start getting into sort of shadier, wetter backyards. Golden Alexanders are a great example of a flower that provides food for bees, but whose leaves feed butterflies. The black swallowtail develops on the leaves of Golden Alexanders. Red twig dogwood, which is a shrub, not a tree, it supports several specialist bees, as well as numerous butterflies and moths. And the list goes on and on. You'll see that there's shade-tolerant goldenrods and asters that complement our sun-blooming goldenrods and asters. In general, the best flowers for bees are white, yellow, and blue. And if you're unsure of whether a flower at a nursery is good for bees or not, just look at the flower. Are there bees on it? If there are no bees on it, but there are bees on other flowers in the nursery, chances are the flower you're looking at may not be the most attractive. And it's really easy to see this, especially on cultivars. Now, a cultivar is a species that has been bred by people for a trait that we deem impressive, but often means that bees don't deem it so impressive. One of these cultivars they're called doubled cultivars. It means that humans have said, let's breed a lot of petals into this flower. On the left, we have the wild type sunflower, which means it's just a straight species. It has some petals, but the interior has all the pollen and nectar that bees are going to need. Along the way, some people said, hey, what if we just made sunflowers with a lot of petals? And we made the teddy bear sunflower. This is great for us and cut flower arrangements because it also doesn't sprinkle pollen all over your kitchen table. But it's really bad for bees. How is a bee supposed to find pollen in that flower? The answer is it can't. And not only because it's physically hard to get in there, but also when we breed plants to upregulate or increase the number of petals, the flower traits are often linked to the nectar and pollen traits. A plant has a finite pool of resources, so committing more of that resource to petals means it can commit fewer resources to pollen and nectar. So one of the biggest things you can do is avoiding double cultivars in the nursery. And the bees will tell you, bees will not be on these double cultivars. The second thing you can do is also avoid nectarless cultivars. Just like the double cultivars, a lot of common garden plants have been bred so they no longer provide nectar. Now, these are not native plants, and like petunias and daylilies and ornamental roses and pom-poms, but they are flowers. They're just not flowers that bees will visit. And so all of this, there's no wrong way to garden for bees. But there's no wrong way to garden, but the best way to garden for bees is to think about how you can balance your aesthetic preferences with the ecological needs of insects. So maybe a nice striking a balance would be a lace cap hydrangea that instead of being a pom-pom has a nice flat surface with lots of pollen and nectar. Or instead of an ornamental rose, a wild rose that has lots of pollen and nectar. So just thinking about how we can strike a balance between what's commonly available in nurseries and what bees like. Good. Okay, that was a lot about S, which was spreading native plants. The second, I promise I'll go much faster here. So the second is employing a life cycle approach, the E. So thinking not about just flowers in the garden, but what do bees need throughout their life cycle? Where do they nest? What do they need over the winter? There's a huge movement in North America right now to hashtag leave the leaves. The idea being that leaves that fall from trees or leaves in your garden that fall from your wildflowers are not litter, and that in fact they contain the offspring and the immature stages of butterflies and bees and beetles and hoverflies and moths. And so what does this mean? I want to emphasize it does not mean leaving a mess. This does not mean like you should just like forget about everything. There's a balance that you can strike. So you can rake leaves off of lawns. Maybe don't use a leaf blower, which is very harsh, but instead rake them. You can spread them into a 2-inch layer over garden beds or areas that you don't use for recreation. Leaving the leaves on your lawn will result in rot and sort of unsightly patches next spring. Raking them and placing them over beds gently is not going to disturb the insects in them, and it's going to allow you to have areas for insects and areas for play. You can cut stems from your gardens too, and we can chat about this if you're curious about how to leave stems for bees. But you can place any stems that you cut in a pile off to the side. You can place it in a neat pile, and that'll be shelter for chipmunks or cover for bees that nest in rotting wood. And the last thing I'll say is it's best to leave the leaves intact. Some people will like to mulch the leaves or shred them to add mulch to your garden. But by shredding leaves, you actually shred all the insects that are living on them. For example, morning cloak butterflies overwinter as adults beneath leaves, and shredding leaves will almost certainly shred the morning cloaks that are some of the first insects active in spring. E, the second E, stands for eliminating pesticides. It's really simple. What kills a mosquito always kills a bee. There's no insecticide that does not kill a bee. And so I'm going to leave it at that. Just understand that when you apply pesticides to your yard, killing an insect that eats your flowers or your shrubs, those are insects just like bees, and spreading that is going to harm them. So the best thing you can do is get out and vote for pesticide legislation, and also encourage others to restrict the use of pesticides for the health of insects, but also the health of us. This is my favorite part. This is discovering what's around you. This is D. I hope that I've inspired you to make practice out of some of this and to go out and look for bees next year in your garden or wherever you like to find flowers. There's a quote by poet Mary Oliver, which says, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." And I really think this applies here. People really care about what they know, and they're only going to protect about what they care about. And so if you don't know the bees, if you have never paid attention to them, you have a lot of distance from bees. And that's what breeds fear. That's why people are scared of bees, is because we haven't gotten up close to know that cellophane bees really can't hurt at all, that these bees are really busy at the grocery store and they would never hurt a fly. And so by making a practice out of it, even if it's just 5 minutes a day, what do you notice? What happens when a bee lands on a flower with a butterfly? Does a bee visit the same flower all in a row? Are there certain flowers in your garden that the bee doesn't visit? You can ask these, there's no such thing as a bad question. Like, ask yourself these questions about what you know or what you're seeing. And I promise you that this whole network will start to unravel. Once you tug on a single idea, like a bumblebee, you'll find that everything is connected to it. There are flies that parasitize bumblebees, and there are spiders that eat those flies. And then there are flowers that depend on the pollination from those parasitic flies. And then you'll start seeing mockingbirds and robins in your garden. And you'll just start seeing how everything from the simple act of watching a bee is now interconnected. If you're on the East Coast, there are some bees that you can spot. So in your backyards or at the local park, you can go out. First warm day in spring, when it's like, there's nothing to see here, cellophane bees will be out. 50 degrees or more, sunny patch at the edge of the woods, you can find cellophane bees. If you plant purple coneflowers or sunflowers in your garden, look for bicolored striped sweat bees, which are bright green on their heads and thoraxes, and then black and white on their abdomen. And then anywhere, anytime during the summer, any flower on the street, you can find Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. These are very adaptable alongside people, and they're just a really great way of reminding yourself that urban nature, or nature really, is all around us. I even had them land on the flowers at a dinner table. And the last is share with others. To save our native bees, it's going to take a hive. So, take what you learned today, take what you learn on your own, discover, and share your enthusiasm with it to other people. Get people excited about green bees and bees that live underground and bees that only visit sunflowers. And so I'm going to conclude with a takeaway. And the takeaway here is that if you ever forget seeds, you ever forget what SEEDS means, but you still want to save the bees, remember this. Remember that honeybees don't need saving, and that the instinct to raise honeybees or buy honey is not what we need to help our environment. And 2, remembering seeds is as easy as going to a patch of flowers and introducing yourself to your bee neighbors. Just taking the time to watch them and notice them will remind you of the things that they need. They don't ask for a lot, but by taking small, intentional, and repeatable actions like planting their favorite flowers throughout the year, or telling the pesticide company, you know what, we're not interested, please don't come this year. or teaching a child that bees should be revered and not feared. Each and every one of us now has the agency to make a difference, to keep our forests full of Andrena aerugeniae, to keep our old fields full of Bombus fervidus, to keep our pine barrens buzzing with Caletes validus and our meadows with Andrena nubecula, to keep our headlands full with Hebropoda laboriosa and our wetlands with these tiny Duphoria noviangliae, our dunes with tons of little tiny Caletes speculiferus, and our gardens full of Agapostum inverescens, all of whom can enrich our lives and nourish our bodies and help us to grow a more sustainable future. So thanks so much.
Wow, Nick, I was so busy clapping for you that I couldn't unmute myself. That was just absolutely a fabulous presentation. The chat is just full of tons of thank you, and what a fabulous presentation you did, filled with passion. And there are a lot of questions, and I'm going to start with a question about your passion. And this is a question, let me see if I can find who. Oh yeah, Crystal, she and I, and I'm sure lots of other people want to know, how did you first become so passionate about bees? And have you always been interested in them?
That's a great question. Actually, I was really scared of bees for like the first 20 years of my life. Yeah, I vividly remember like a carpenter bee. It must have been buzzing my head while I was in my backyard growing up. And I like ran for the hills. I like ran inside, slammed the door. I was freaked out. My heart was racing. And only later when I started studying bees did I realize it was a male bee. Male bees guard territories. I had nothing to be afraid of. Like there was no threat. And yet I had no idea what the world of bees was. And so I had that distance. And so I was worried about them. When I got to college, I was really interested in learning how to garden. And so I started volunteering with the Student Garden Club. And I was captivated with it. How does a tiny little yellow tomato flower turn into like a delicious red fruit? And I loved cooking, and I was just so intrigued with like, how does this work? And so I started working, doing research with a professor here at Tufts, where I did my undergraduate. And I studied bumblebees, and I was just hooked. And my project was to rear bumblebees. So we caught some queens in the spring, and we're trying to understand how they build their nests. And I think it was focusing on these sort of like this life stage that no one really knew about. We didn't really know how it was. And you got this glimpse of how a queen over 30 days goes from 1 bee to 8 bees. And when all of her workers emerged, I was hooked. And then I discovered that there's all these other bees. Like while I was studying bumblebees, I didn't really know about native bees. And then I remember the first time I saw like a green bee. I was like, whoa, that bee is green. And that's like 10 feet from where I live. It's crazy. And then, yeah, I was hooked.
Wow, that's great. I loved hearing that story. And it's so, it's just so charming that you were scared of bees to start with, and now you're such a bee advocate. Nick, did you take up most of those photographs, the ones that weren't credited? Because the photographs were pretty phenomenal, and people were curious if you were the photographer on the ones that weren't credited.
Yeah, I am the photographer. I love the bee photography. It's how I got my start as a bird watcher. Like I fell in love with nature through bird watching, and now I go bee watching. So I bring my camera, and instead of looking up at the trees, I look down at the flowers. And photographing bees it requires like knowing where bees are going next. You have to like be able to anticipate where they're going to land and how long they're going to be there. And so it's a way that I get to know the bees too.
So cool. People are suggesting that maybe you could write a book. You have all the ingredients plus the photography. So after you finish your PhD, which is like a book in itself, and if you're not too sick of writing, we would all buy your book here. All right, we do have some other questions for you. And I just want to let everybody know, I might not get to everybody's questions, but Nick has his email up there. So if you didn't get your question answered, you can always email him. One question has to do with diatomaceous earth. Somebody uses it and spreads it on the ground to combat slugs, I think. And they're curious if that is dangerous for the bees as well. She's worried that it might be.
Nope, I think that's fine for the bees. Yep.
Great, cool. All right. on that topic of things that are dangerous for bees, any comments or any ways you want to address neonicotinoids, and especially if people are buying plants for their garden, any suggestions?
Yeah, so neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, are a group of pesticides that are really, really insidious. They are primarily used in both agricultural and sort of residential areas, although there's been a lot of recent legislature to ban neonic sales and use on private lands, on private residential lands. Neonics impact bees in two main ways. There's the obvious direct way, where if a bee lands on the spray and consumes the spray, it's going to die. It's an insecticide. But the second way, which is far more worrying, are the indirect effects, or the sublethal effects, I'll say. The ones that don't directly kill bees, so you don't see fewer bees in your garden, but they make bees less able to be bees. What I mean by this is that it impedes bees' ability to buzz their flight muscles. It impedes bees' ability to navigate back to the nest. For species like bumblebees, there's evidence that it makes nurse bees stop taking care of the brood. They just sit there. There's been video evidence in hives that show the worker bees that have been exposed to pesticides are still alive, but they just sit there as though there isn't a baby that needs to be taken care of. And so this is perhaps a very concerning aspect of pesticides, is all this sublethal impact. So a lot of legislation is built upon what is the dose that kills a bee. But it doesn't take into consideration what is the dose that makes bees less able to be bees. And I would argue that consideration of both is really important. Okay, now the practical side. First practical side, it's like, don't apply pesticides to your yard. Sometimes you can't actually control that because the plants you buy at big box stores and a lot of stores are pre-treated with pesticides. Either they're sprayed in the greenhouse or they're actually grown from seeds that are treated with pesticides. So for bees, especially if they're perennial plants, I think there's really not much you can do other than be a really informed consumer. So go to your big box store, wherever you buy nursery plants, and is there labeling? And there's now more stricter rules about labeling. Is there labeling that says treated with pesticides or not? And even if there isn't, and you accidentally buy a plant that was treated with pesticides, assuming it's a perennial plant, that pesticide will pass through the system of the plant in a few years. And so the long-term impact is far greater of you applying pesticides every year than you buying a plant once that was treated and then you never treating it again. Still, the best thing you can do is go find a local nursery, ask them and require them to source plants from nurseries that don't use pesticides. And there are lots of nurseries now shifting towards that, either growing their own plants, having a portion of their plants that are pesticide-free, and getting better about labeling. It can really happen from you, the consumer, pressuring nurseries to carry different plants.
Thanks,
But
Nick.
yeah.
I was going to say, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. And I'll just encourage people, if you live kind of in any small town or the towns and your town is using pesticides, check and see if they're using pesticides. I found out that my pretty little town did use neonicotinoids on the main lawn, but now they're not, thanks to me bringing it up. And that be brave for bees, I guess I would say. All right, here's a question about bee hotels, which are very popular, but lately there's been some kind of information about do bee hotels, if not cleaned and kind of maintained properly, pass on diseases and parasites to the bees using them?
The short answer is yes. So in order to, I actually have a slide here. Bee hotels are very fun, but they are a responsibility. And it's important to know how to be a good hotel manager in order to make it a safe place for the bees to live. So the bee hotel, as I explained earlier, is a block with a series of cavities that our renters will use, like those mason bees. And in order to make it a safe place for them to live, you need to make sure the cavities are cleaned out at the end of every year. And one way to do that is you can put in paper straws, or you can replace the blocks from year to year, and then lightly treat them after the bees have emerged. I recommend placing them, if you're going to do this bee hotel route, I recommend placing them in sort of sunnier locations to prevent the buildup of mold. And then definitely make sure that you rotate the cavities that you're using. So if it's a wooden block, having two sets, one which goes out in 1 year, the second which goes out the next year. For using the straw or the bamboo reeds, disposing of them after the bees have emerged, and making sure bees do not reuse cavities.
Great, thanks, Nick. We have actually a question from Aldo. I'm going to ask him to unmute, and he's going to ask his question. Hopefully I can do this. Let's see. All right, ask to unmute. All right, Aldo.
Hello.
Hi, Aldo.
Hi. So I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So how does the leaf cutting bee gets its name?
Oh, that's a great question. So the leaf cutting bee gets its name from how it builds its nest. So it builds its nest in a cavity above ground, like a paper straw. And in order to make sure that every baby has its own bedroom, it collects leaves that serve as doors. So it gathers a leaf from a plant, like a rose plant, and it pastes it along the side of the wall. And it gets another leaf, and it makes a little bedroom out of leaves, and it lays a bee egg inside that bedroom. And then the next day, she'll build another bedroom for another bee, and that will be made out of leaves too. And they do this so that every bee has its own little room that it can grow and grow up in.
Thanks. Great question, Aldo. I love it. Be smart. So I have maybe time for one last question, and this has to do with the carpenter bees. It's from Wendy. She's wondering if there's a best time to plug up the carpenter bee holes to avoid any interruption with their hatching. Like, you wouldn't want to plug them up and the babies can't get out. So any thoughts on that?
I think the best time to do that would be in early May. So look for carpenter bees on flowers. I guess it depends where you live. I shouldn't say early May. I'm not quite. Wendy, where do you live?
I don't know where Wendy lives.
Okay, well, Maine.
Oh, she lives in Maine.
So,
Yep.
Middle of May, like second, third week of May. Look for carpenter bees on flowers. And once you see them on flowers, I would recommend plugging up the nest entrance then. That'll give time for any bees that are overwintering in the nest to emerge, but also not give them enough time to make new babies.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. And I want to just thank everybody who came tonight. We all have such great information, and especially love the idea of getting to know our local bee neighbors when the spring comes around next year. And Nick, I wish I could hug you, because this was really such a fabulous presentation. And I know we're going to have you come up to the Harris Center and maybe even lead a bee walk so we can find out more about bees. And for those of you that are Zoom and maybe can't get to the Harris Center, I'm sure we're going to continue to have Nick as a presenter for the Harris Center. So thank you so much. Let's give Nick a round of applause, and thank you all for coming out, and have a good evening.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Miles. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Nick.